You think you know what we're going to talk about.
But unfortunately, I fell down a damn rabbit hole and I've not gotten out yet.
Knife bros.
I literally Googled Sebastian Stan hands. But just when you least expect it, we changed the game.
Well, yeah, because like usually in astrology, they would partner up air signs with fire signs.
All right, you can huggle.
Time travel stories, and
At the end of the day, only one thing matters. We decide.
Well, we should make it a topic. Unfortunately, I didn't take German in school. I took Spanish and I don't remember any of it.
Three Fates Decide podcast.
Hi everyone. Here's another episode of Three Fates Decide. I am your host, Liz, and I'm here with one of my co-hosts, Mary.
Hello.
Yes, our other co-host, Sam, won't be joining us tonight, mainly because this particular episode, she doesn't have very much familiarity with it. So it's just going to be the two of us this evening as we record this.
She's also on vacation. Lucky her.
Yeah, you know.
We might as well tell the real reason why she's not here. She's on vacation. Lucky her.
Right. And well, we decided that this is the opportunity for us to do an episode or two about something that she is not that familiar with, but we are, so we can talk about it.
We can nerd out now.
Right. Anyway, so this episode is going to be like, I guess we could call this like almost like a part one of part two in a way.
Yes.
Right. This episode, we're going to, as briefly as possible, try to talk a bit about the world of A Song of Ice and Fire, aka Game of Thrones, to those of you who happen to be TV fans only. Because obviously, if you've read the novels, you're pretty familiar with a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in this episode. But, you know, if you happen to be somebody who only watched the TV show, or maybe you've not watched it at all and you've not read any of the books, but you don't mind the spoilers that are going to undoubtedly come up in this episode because you're curious. Like, you just want to know what the heck it was the big deal of the last 10 years. This is the episode for you. And like I just said, we are going to undoubtedly be spoiling quite a few things that kind of comes up in both the TV show and in the novels. So you have been warned.
Yes.
Yes.
So, big spoiler alerts. Although at this point, if you haven't seen the show or read the books, you're probably not going to.
Yeah, especially the books, because we all know, for those of us who have read the books, we all know that George has said he is still working on book 6, The Winds of Winter, and the last book that came out, A Dance with Dragons, came out in 2011, which was the same year that HBO showed the first season of Game of Thrones. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure he'll finish it eventually, but I wouldn't hold my breath on when that will be.
Yeah, I mean, even the guy has given up on telling people his estimates because he knows that he's going to get a bazillion complaints again if he attempts to do that. So,
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at any rate, so just before we start, I just wanted to mention that we are going to be using a couple different sources you know, for the information that we're going to be talking about in this episode. For me, I'm going to primarily be using my copy of The World of Ice and Fire, which is a book that Martin actually completed that he probably shouldn't have spent so much time on, but instead of writing the manuscript of The Winds of Winter, but it's a pretty it's a pretty good book if you don't already own a copy of it. It's basically a fictional history of Westeros. So I'm going to be referring to some of the stuff that's in the book on my side of the discussion. What are you going to be using, Mary?
I'm going to be using Westeros.org. And I'm also going to be using the Game of Thrones wiki from fandom.com because I was looking and it has a lot. The Game of Thrones wiki on fandom.com has a lot of information. It'll give you the Game of Thrones characters from the actual TV show, which kind of will tie in obviously into the book that we'll be talking about. But it tells you all the different noble houses. It tells you the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. It'll tell you about Beyond the Wall. So there's lots of information on it that I'll be using to help refresh my knowledge and expand my knowledge because I unfortunately have not been able to finish the first book because I'm just don't have time with a little one.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean but what I have read is like I want to finish it because it's so good. It's just
Yeah.
I haven't been able to do it yet. So
Right.
my
No.
knowledge is going to be more contained with the TV show, more so
Right.
than the book knowledge. However, that's why I'm using both of these to kind of make sure I'm saying what I should be saying.
Yeah. I mean, if you guys are actually interested in reading the books, like you totally should when you get a chance. I did briefly mention this when we did our fiction and writing episode a few episodes ago.
Mm-hmm.
I did briefly talk about A Song of Ice and Fire, but I totally agree. Like what you were just saying, Mary, is that like in terms of the craft of writing, it is a really good book series, not just because of the entertainment value, from the stories itself, from the books itself, but also if you want to like actually study like narrative writing craft, storytelling techniques, I would definitely say that this book series is one of those book series that you would totally want to read and kind of study, you know, from somebody who's an experienced writer of
I
fiction.
I agree. I
Yeah.
agree 100%. His the way he has with words and how he can literally bring scenes to life with just writing. It's to me that's a very rare craft. I don't find too many authors that can actually make me see the scene in my head when I'm reading it the way he can.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Which is why I genuinely do hope we eventually will get book 6 because there were so many things in the fifth book that
Mhm.
were cliffhangers that okay, granted if you've seen the TV show you probably have some ideas as to like how those storylines got resolved, but I would love to know how he interpreted it and also the fact that they changed stuff in the TV show from the novels for some characters and some storylines. So the quote unquote real resolutions and real to the storylines he wrote in the books. I want to know how it really ended. Okay, so
Yeah, I don't blame you. I would too. And like I
yeah,
said, I will eventually get all of the books read. It's just with a 4-year-old, it is extremely difficult for me to find the time. And
right.
then at night, by the time I go to bed, I'm usually so exhausted, I'm literally falling in bed asleep.
Yeah, I mean, you may want to invest in audiobooks because I mean, yeah, because it's like while you're doing something else, you can listen
Mhm.
to somebody narrating the books to you, and that may have to be the way you consume the novels.
Probably. Most
Yeah,
likely it will be, yes.
yeah. But at any rate, so there's a lot of material to cover, but that one episode just on this alone is not enough. So I think
Right.
just so you guys are aware, we're going to like briefly cover some of the important locations for this particular series. We're just going to briefly cover like some of the different areas and locations. And you know what? If you guys are interested in us doing like maybe a short mini series of episodes where we expand into more detail about some of these places and maybe some of the people that we're going to talk about in this episode, we are more than happy to eventually record that at a later point in time. But for now, we're going to try to, cover the very basic information you need to know to understand what the heck is going on if you attempt to watch the TV show or read the books. So, anyway,
Right.
just to briefly start. So, obviously, this particular book series, this TV show, it's set in a fictional alternate universe where it's a fantasy, it's like a low fantasy version of medieval Europe, basically. And George R. R. Martin has pretty much said this, that like he got inspired, with like the different cultures of the different kingdoms that the story takes place in by actual European countries. Like some areas are based off of France, some are based off of England, Scotland, etc. Which, if you were to dive a little deeper about the different kingdoms that come up in the series, you will notice some bits of the culture commonalities between real countries in the medieval time period. Okay, so I guess one of the places we should start off with is a very important kingdom. First off, let's just start with the basics. So a huge chunk of the story of Game of Thrones takes place in the continent of Westeros. Okay. They call it the Seven Kingdoms of Westeros, but if you want to get really technical, it's actually 9 regions, 7 of whom were originally individual kingdoms, and a couple areas were considered territories that were, kind of going back and forth between the other kingdoms as to who actually had control over it. Which, for people who know real world history, that is a very common thing that actually happened.
Yes.
Yes, especially in like medieval Europe, which again, like I said before, Martin based this whole fictional world off of. And also to a lesser degree, part of the story does take place in another continent called Essos. For those of you who are obviously familiar with the TV show, Essos comes into play in Daenerys' storyline, primarily, and to a certain extent, Arya's storyline in the later seasons. So we will briefly mention a few of the cities in Essos where, Arya and Daenerys travel to. And, but most of what we're going to be talking about is Westeros. So I guess for me personally as a fan, I don't know about you, Mary, but for me, the one part of Westeros that I have the most attachment to is, of course, also the biggest of the 7 kingdoms / 9 regions of Westeros, which is the North. Yes, that's right. For those of you not familiar with this fictional universe, it is called the North.
Yes.
Nice and simple.
I have a strong affinity for the North as well. So yes.
Yes. So the North, geographically speaking, makes up roughly half of the continent of Westeros. That is how big this particular region / kingdom is. And as I describe it, it used to be a separate kingdom before they all got united into one giant territory, pretty much, ruled by one king. The one family who is in charge of running / ruling the North on behalf of the actual king of Westeros is, of course, House Stark.
Yes.
Yes, that's right. Their name is Stark. Now, obviously, I don't know if this is for a fact that George R. R. Martin named this particular family after Tony Stark, but he has admitted that he is an Iron Man fan. So, and hey, I could picture Tony wanting to be part of this family, wanting to be called Lord Stark.
Oh, I could too. Why does everything seem to tie back to the MCU?
I know, right?
Everything ties back to Marvel.
Pretty much. Anyway, so just to very briefly talk about this particular family, they are a very major family in the saga that we call A Song of Ice and Fire. House Stark, once upon a time, were the kings of the North, or rather, king in the North, as they're often referred to. They were the one family out of all the different families in the North who were once petty kings, and over many centuries, they became the kings. And another interesting fact within the lore, this fictional history, is the fact that one of their the progenitor of House Stark, if you want to call him that, was a man known as Brandon Stark, aka Bran the Builder, because according to history/legend, he built the wall, which is what I like to describe a huge ass wall that crosses the continent, basically, to separate Westeros from stuff on the other side, which we will briefly get into a little bit later. And he also built quite a few other things. Like, there were rumors that he built some other famous castles throughout Westeros, but of course, the guy lived roughly 2,000 years before the start of Game of Thrones, you know, the first novel in the book series. So, how much of it is quote unquote real history and how much of it is just legend, nobody knows. But they're still entertaining stories. And of course, one of the most important things, other than the wall that he built, is the family castle that House Stark still occupies all the way to the quote unquote present when the book series and the TV show takes place, which is the Castle Winterfell. I believe, well, they don't really get into it in the TV show as much, but I believe over, like, on top of and around hot springs. So a lot of fans especially speculate that the design of the castle would actually include an early version of indoor plumbing to help keep the castle warm, using the hot water pipes flowing through the walls.
I believe it because it's cold in the north.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. You could make an argument that some of the culture, some of the traditions are loosely based off of Scotland, maybe even bits of Scandinavia with the Vikings and stuff like that, because I could kind of see some similarities, actually. What about you?
Yeah, definitely.
Yep. Yeah. At any rate, so House Stark happens to be the family that runs the North, and they have ran the North since they became the kings that, beat out all the other families to control the North. And they eventually surrendered their title, their crown, to another family, who is the family that unite all the other kingdoms. And we will get to them a little bit later in the episode. Yeah, I guess that's like all what we can say about the North without turning this entire episode into just about this one family and the lords that serve under them. Anything you want to add?
No, I think I'm good because, like you said, we could make this episode just about the North.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
If I start talking,
Yep.
we'll just keep it all about the North. Let's go. Let's keep it moving.
So I think logically we should move just south of the North to the Riverlands.
Yes.
What do you think?
Yes, that's just what I was thinking. The Riverlands, they're roughly in the center of the continent of Westeros. They've been ruled by the Ironborn, at the time of the books, it was House Tully that still rules, I think, or is it House Frey?
Well, that gets a little tricky. So originally at the start of the books, it was House Tully. And we kind of get this, we kind of know this because at the start of, Game of Thrones, Ned Stark's wife was once named Catelyn Tully.
Yes.
So her dad is technically the ruler of the Riverlands. The person who rules all of Westeros. They get referred to as Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. But the thing is that the Riverlands was never a separate kingdom. That is actually one of the 9 regions. So there's like basically 2 regions out of the 9 that were never actually kingdoms. And I did mention earlier how 2 of these regions happen to be territories where the other actual 7 kingdoms were fighting over who controlled it. And one of them happened to be the Riverlands because, like you actually mentioned earlier, Mary, at one point the Ironborn, who are from the Iron Islands, which is a separate kingdom, they did have control of the Riverlands. And at another point, the rulers of the Stormlands also control the Riverlands. So because of the central location of the Riverlands, which you did mention before, it's very easy for the different kingdoms to be fighting over the most central part of the continent. I think George R. Martin said that parts of, I think, France or Germany, or maybe like the smaller countries like the Netherlands or whatever, is his influences over this particular region. And as you can guess by the name, the Riverlands, it's an area where it's got a lot of rivers flowing through it, which means that with all this access to water, it's very fertile agricultural territory, which makes sense why somebody would want to control this land to get more farmland.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's all we can get into about that. The Vale is to the east of the Riverlands.
Yes.
So what do you know about it?
It's small for the most part. It's not nearly as big as some of the other kingdoms. It's ruled by the House of Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
They're only accessible during the warmer months, during the warmer seasons, because of the way it's situated in the mountains, that snow covers the passes during the winter and you can't get to it.
Yes, exactly.
It's pretty much the main information about the Vale.
Yeah, the ruling house of the Vale had for many centuries been the House Aaron, and their castle is called the Eyrie, and it is a mountain fortress, which from a logistical perspective is actually a brilliant move because you're up in a freaking mountain, and if you are an invading army wanting to attack the Eyrie, good luck. I mean, forgetting about winter time for a moment, it's a freaking mountain. You have to send your army to climb up a freaking mountain.
Right.
With all the siege equipment and try to attack this thing. And meanwhile, the defensive army, they just have to drop a bunch of rocks on you and that's it. It's
pretty
over.
much. Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's
But as I kind of we kind of implied earlier, eventually this was one of the 7 kingdoms of Westeros, and eventually they did have to surrender to the people who united Westeros, and that's because these particular people found a way to get around the whole "we live in a mountain fortress" kind of defense. Yeah. Let's just say it involved aerial attack. Okay. Which, for those of you not familiar with Game of Thrones, hint, hint, we are talking about a fictional medieval fantasy world. What famous form of potential aerial attack can you guys imagine somebody might be using in a fantasy world? Take a wild guess.
I mean, it couldn't be dragons, could it? Of course it is.
Yes, somebody has control of dragons, and yeah, having a large flying fire-breathing dragon is a pretty good way to get around the whole I am on a huge ass mountain
And you can't get to the
defensive tactic.
pretty much.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I guess we'll stop there on the Veil.
Yeah. The Reach will be our next area.
Yes, the Reach. Yes, the Reach. It is what most people would describe as like almost the garden slash breadbasket of Westeros because
Mhm.
it is all the way in the south. Like it is one of the most southern kingdoms of
Yes.
Westeros. So you can imagine that it has very warm climates, plenty of fertile farmland, and actually for those of you who are familiar with the TV show and even the books, it's also pretty famous for producing some excellent wine. So you can definitely tell
Mhm.
that Reach is loosely inspired by southern France and possibly Italy as well.
Yeah.
With all that with all the vino going on and plenty of crops.
Mhm.
And of course, different families have ruled the Reach actually, but when we get to the start of Game of Thrones, the ruling family is House Tyrell, and they appropriately live in a castle named Highgarden because of the agricultural power of the Reach. You can imagine that they have quite a bit of money.
Mhm.
And yeah. Also, one of the other interesting features about the Reach I should mention is actually it's also where the Citadel, which is like the central educational capital, I guess you could call it, of Westeros is located. Yeah, if you want to get the best and highest levels of education in this fictional world, you go to the Citadel. And unfortunately, it's men only. So if you happen to be a really brainy woman, then unfortunately you can't get into their version of university. So tragic. So tragic.
It is, but unfortunately, as a fictional world that's kind of keeping in the themes with medieval European culture, women were not educated back then. Not really. I mean, most women were not educated past a certain point. And what they were educated in was how to care for a home, care for children, care for a husband. That's what they were taught. They weren't taught whether they were bright in math or languages or whatever it was. Unfortunately, a lot of wasted talent. A lot of talent went to waste back in the day.
Right. Yeah, it is very unfortunate.
Can you imagine where we would be if women were allowed to be educated back then?
The Citadel does come up quite a few times in the TV show, mainly because again, because it is the location of their, like, I guess you could consider it like their equivalent of a university. The most educated people in all of Westeros are the Order of the Maesters, and that is where they get their education from. That is where they get all their training before they get sent out to advise various nobles and even the king of Westeros himself. I guess like that's the main thing. We'll end off in with the Reach, unless there's anything else you can think of to mention.
No, that's pretty much covers it.
The Westerlands, as you can probably guess by the name, they are a kingdom that is on. They are a western side kingdom. So what info do you have?
Um, they were known uh, as Kingdom of the Rock for a while. They
Mhm.
are ruled from the castle of Casterly Rock, which is ruled by House Lannister.
Yep.
It is actually one of the smaller regions, but it has the largest population of people.
Yes, it does.
It's also a very highly sought after for its mines because it has a lot of precious metals in
Yep.
the area.
Oh, yes, it does. It definitely does. Uh, yes. Those of us who have read the books or seen the TV show know very well that the Westerlands is famous for its mining because, well, House Lannister they're one of those families who like to throw their money around.
Yeah. Yeah. They do.
Yeah. And hey, let's not forget also their sigil is a roaring lion
It is.
with a golden lion on a red background. So
Mhm.
hey, they know who they are.
Yes, they do.
Yeah.
Very much so.
House Lannister have actually ruled the Westerlands for a very, very long time. In fact, when the Westerlands stopped becoming, when they were no longer an independent kingdom, the last king of the Westerlands was a Lannister. So they got to keep their crown. Well, they got to keep their position as the ruling family of the Westerlands because they did eventually surrender. So, and actually, a fun fact. Like you mentioned earlier, the castle they rule is called Casterly Rock, and yet why is the family called Lannister? Well, the funny thing is that the original owners of Casterly Rock were a family called Casterly, and obviously they don't know if this is based on real history or if it's just an amusing made up tale just to make them look good, but their ancestor, known as Lan the Clever, somehow tricked the Casterly family to abandon their castle, and he took over the place. And then over time, the family that he started eventually became known as the Lannisters. Now, whether that story is true, completely made up bullshit, or something in between, we don't know. We don't know, but it is a fun story that they like to repeat over and over again.
Yes.
I think it's pretty amusing.
It is.
I guess the one last fact to mention before we move on is in a Game of Thrones, House Lannister is extremely significant in the events happening. Just like we want to point out how Stark has a huge impact on the stories in the saga. House
Mhm.
Lannister does as well because the Queen of Westeros, at least at the start, was Queen Cersei Lannister, and her dad is of course Tywin Lannister, the ruler of the Westerlands. So
Yes.
we should not be surprised that they are heavily involved in the shenanigans that happen.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. I think we should go to the Crown Lands.
Okay. Yes, the Crown Lands. Yeah.
They're not really so much they're not really so much a kingdom
Right.
as they're one of the 9 regions.
Yep.
Because it just kind of sits there.
Yeah. I think the Crown Lands are like basically territory that belong to like a mix of the Reach and the Stormlands and maybe
Riverlands and the
the
Stormlands.
Riverlands. Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't remember which kingdoms it was
Mhm.
originally a part of, but it's basically like border. I remember it was like land that was like bordering 2 different kingdoms, and then it became a particular region that was separate from the 2 original areas.
Right.
And that was because, as you could probably guess by the name Crown Lands, the capital of Westeros is located in this area.
King's Landing.
Yes, King's Landing. Now, I'm sure for people, now, of course, if you know the books, you've read the books, then you know exactly why it's called King's Landing and why some of the land around is called the Crown Lands. To a degree, they do mention in the TV show, but just to explain, we kind of mentioned this earlier when we were talking about the Vale, but the family that united, or yeah, they united Westeros is House Targaryen, who
Yeah, we'll call it United.
yeah. Yeah, we'll call it united. The more accurate term is they sent in their army and their huge ass dragons and basically told people that listen here.
We rule now. So you
Yeah,
either
and-
kneel or die.
Yeah, you either bend the knee or I'm going to have my dragon burn you alive and you
Yeah.
can suck it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much what they said.
So, but we will politely call it uniting.
Yes.
Yeah. King's Landing is the capital of Westeros, and as you could probably guess by our references to dragons, it is literally the part of Westeros that House Targaryen landed their army and landed their dragons first on Westeros.
Yes.
And they were like, hey, let's make this the capital.
Yep.
Because why not?
Yes. Well,
It's
it
all
was
good.
also, wasn't it also the closest to, it was also the closest place, maybe not quite the closest place, but one of the closer places from their home on Dragonstone to
Yes.
invade.
Yes, actually it is. It's literally right across the bay.
Yeah.
Right. So for those of you who happen to be medieval history nerds, you could probably guess that this reference that George R. R. Martin likely used was the Norman Conquest, where you had William the Conqueror landing from Normandy in France to England. So,
Mhm.
and appropriately enough, the first king of House Targaryen, who basically took over the place, happens to be known as King Aegon the First, also known as King Aegon the Conqueror. Why does this ring a bell now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Like we said, King's Landing is the capital. So the lands immediately around this capital are referred to as the Crown Lands. So from a feudal system perspective, it basically means that the Crown Lands are under the direct control of, at the time, House Targaryen. But of course, by the time we get to Game of Thrones, the TV show, and even the beginning of the novels, we have a completely different dynasty ruling.
Yes, we have House Baratheon as the rulers.
Yes, we will get to them in just a little bit.
Yes.
But yeah, so whoever basically occupies, whoever's ruling Westeros, their direct domain that they have direct control over is the Crown Lands. So the Crown Lands obviously will provide some of the food source for the capital, which is of course a huge city, as you would imagine any capital of a kingdom would be. But of course, again, like any huge capital city, they do get some of their food from the Reach, which is a neighboring kingdom. So it shouldn't surprise you that because of this fact, the ruling family, which we mentioned earlier, was House Tyrell. They do pop up in the story, shall we say? I guess like before we move on, the one interesting fact I'm going to bring up is actually not related to the books per se. It's actually related to the TV show. Starting in season 2 of the TV show, they used an actual location to portray King's Landing, particularly the outdoor scenes, obviously, because, the indoor scenes clearly could be done within, studio sets. But
Yeah.
for the outdoor street scenes and for scenes that are meant to be, on the ramparts of the castle, which incidentally is called the Red Keep, by the way. It was actually filmed in Dubrovnik, Croatia. And you can imagine once they revealed that particular city is where they filmed the King's Landing scenes, you can imagine tourism went up a lot for Croatia.
Yes. Yes, it did. That was actually it was a huge boon for Croatia, because Croatia is not one of the wealthier Middle Eastern countries.
No, it's not. I mean, it is actually, well, I haven't been able to visit it yet, but from my understanding, from what I've seen, like from pictures and stuff like that, it is a beautiful country. Very nice.
I've heard that too. It would be I think it would be a very interesting place to visit. I don't know that I will ever make it there myself, but it does seem like it's a beautiful country. It really does.
It could go on your travel bucket list.
Yeah.
Guess that's all we can say about the Crown Lands and King's Landing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Iron Islands.
Yeah. Okay, we could talk about the Iron Islands. Yeah, so what do you know about the Iron Islands?
They are several small islands off the west coast of Westeros. They're ruled by House Greyjoy from the Castle of Pike.
Mm-hmm.
They are who are known as the Ironborn because obviously they're the Iron Islands. They are famed for their naval skills. And they had their culture was built on raiding and pillaging of other countries and in the mainlands of Westeros for a very long time.
Yep. I guess from a cultural perspective, you could kind of see how Martin loosely based them off of Vikings, although I would say they're more like the extreme stereotypes of Vikings because people that have a little bit more knowledge of like early medieval Scandinavia would realize that, yeah, they're not just about raiding and pillaging stuff, which they did do. I mean, don't get me wrong. They totally did do that stuff. I mean, it's well documented. But, it's not all pillaging and raiding. I mean, if anything, the pillaging and raiding was mostly during times of the year where the growing season was not very productive in, what we now know as Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Norway, Denmark. So logically, how else can you get resources when it's now wintertime and almost nothing is growing at this point, and whatever you harvested is what you harvested? You get the fighting men to go on a boat and go get stuff.
Yep. Pretty much.
That's why, I would say, especially for people who have read the books in particular, you realize that they do have some cultural commonalities with, Vikings, early Scandinavia. But like I was saying, it's mostly like the really exaggerated extremes almost of the culture. Yes, I guess the other interesting fact to mention is that we kind of briefly touched upon this when we were talking about the Riverlands, but they did rule the Riverlands at a certain point in time. And during the time period that they controlled the Riverlands, they built one of the most infamous and unique features located in the Riverlands, which is this giant monstrosity of a castle, called Harrenhal. And Harrenhal was basically built by a king of the Ironborn named Harren. So obviously Harrenhal, or Harren's Hall, you could imagine is the origin of the name. He decided that, you know what, I'm a dope ass king, and we're dope ass people. So you know what? I'm going to show it off by building a huge ass castle to prove it. And it became the largest castle in Westeros. Very impractical, very impractical. I mean, you need like an actual army of servants to run this place. I mean, the way it's described in the books, it's like, it's like ridiculous. Like, why the hell anybody would want to live in a place like this? I don't get it, but yeah.
Yeah, Harren the Black thought it would be his legacy. He was crazy.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of figure that, only somebody who's kind of crazy would think that a huge ass castle like that makes any sense. Aside from the fact that it's a huge ass castle, the other interesting thing was that at the time that House Targaryen showed up and were conquering things that technically don't belong to them, they showed up at Harrenhal and they did their usual thing of like telling them like, okay, we got dragons, we got an army, surrender now, or we're gonna do our thing. And of course, because it's a huge ass castle, King Harren is all like, no, I'm not gonna surrender, and I think we're pretty safe in here. And yeah, we get to find out how does a castle handle dragon fire. because when this castle actually shows up in a Game of Thrones, in Game of Thrones and in the novels, we already know that it's a half burned down wreck, ruins, and a lot of people in the fandom kind of joke about how being given lordship of this castle Harrenhal means you're going to be cursed to misery and possibly death at some point because that pretty much happened to every owner after after the Targaryens showed up. So, yeah, because of the raiding thing that the Ironborn have a annoying tendency to do, you know, if you were to look at a map of Westeros, you can kind of figure out where did they have a tendency to do a lot of their raiding at. So you can imagine that they are not very good friends with people in the Riverlands, obviously. They are not good friends with people in the North. They are definitely not good friends with people in the Westerlands. And they're not good friends with people in the Reach either because, you know, it's rich farmland. And of course, why wouldn't you show up on your Viking pirate ships and steal stuff?
Yep.
Anything else you can think of? I can't think of much else to add.
No, I think that's probably about it.
Yeah, we got 2 more kingdoms left, folks.
Yes, we are going to the Stormlands.
Yes. They are the primary territory ruled by House Baratheon originally until they became king of Westeros. Although actually it's really, of course, the oldest brother, King Robert, who became king. But he has a younger brother. Well, 2 of them actually. And one of them is technically the one who rules the Stormlands. What other info you got, Mary?
That's about all I got too. There's really not a lot to say about the Stormlands.
Yeah, it's kind of like for me as somebody who didn't read the books, it's kind of annoying that the TV show barely mentions the Stormlands. I'm hoping that the upcoming TV show that HBO's been filming, they do bring up the Stormlands a lot more because some interesting stuff that we're not going to get into in this episode because it's going to be too long. A lot of interesting historical things actually happened in the Stormlands. I guess like one of the interesting stories I am going to mention is so the ruling castle, you know, that the Baratheons live in is a castle called Storm's End. Notice the theme here. It's actually a castle built on like a cliff that overlooks the sea. One of the interesting stories I'm going to mention is that this is back to when the Targaryens showed up and were like, hey, this is our stuff now. There was a different family who, of course, were ruling the Stormlands at the time. And the king was killed. And he had a daughter who was still in who was at Storm's End, and she was, you know, holding the castle on behalf of her dad. So then the Targaryens sent in one of their lieutenants, a guy named Orys Baratheon. And some stuff happened, and he ends up marrying this daughter. And so he technically becomes the Lord of Storm's End and Lord of the Stormlands through some legitimate means by marriage. So you could say that House Baratheon is actually descended from Stormland royalty. And like I mentioned, there's some other historical events that actually happened in the Stormlands, but we're not going to get into it in this episode. Maybe if we do a follow-up episode later on, we could talk about some of these stories.
Yes. We could, and maybe in a separate episode, we can also maybe get more into some of the more notable places in these areas, because we're really just kind of talking about the area itself, and we're not really talking about like more of the like some of the major cities and stuff like that, which we could always get into later.
Yeah. So I mean, guys listening to this, totally let us know if you think that we should dive deeper into all this stuff because you want to nerd out with us, or maybe you want to know because you're a TV fan and the TV show didn't cover a lot of this stuff. So
right.
Yeah. Okay, so the last kingdom of Westeros that we're going to get to is Dorne. So what do you know about Dorne?
Dorne is a very desert-ish climate to it. It is actually ruled by House Martell.
Yep.
It's actually one of the smallest populations because of its climate, but its wine is considered the best wine in the world.
Ah, yes, the Dornish Red. Yes, yeah. And the only reason why I know that is because throughout the books and even to a degree in the TV show, a lot of the wine drinker characters
Yeah,
will usually
Lord
mention
Dornish Red.
we'll mention that particular vintage as a
Yes.
favorite.
I think Tyrion mentions it often,
Yeah.
if I remember correctly. And their seat of power is at Sunspear, so their capital is Sunspear.
Yep.
That's really about all I really have, other than what some of the stuff from like from the TV show,
Which
where
which we're not going to get into here.
right.
Yeah. House Martell does have involvement in the goings on in the series, so they are definitely a family that you have to keep an eye out on. And just as a preview of the next episode, where we actually talk about the TV show and the books to a certain degree, Game of Thrones, I was severely disappointed as a book reader how they handled the Dornish characters other than Oberyn, because there is so much stuff from the books that they cut out in the TV show and it messed everything up. I'm just saying. And all you book fans, all you book readers, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But like I said, I'm not gonna get into it in this episode. Yeah, I guess. I mean, that's pretty much all we can really talk about. I guess the one interesting thing to mention, actually, this is a pretty good segue to something that I didn't mention. Well, that neither of us mentioned in the episode, but in Westeros, there's actually what you would consider three different, for lack of a better term, ethnic groups that live in Westeros. So you basically have like three ethnic groups, you could say. Well, I guess you could consider it fourth if you count the Targaryens into the mix. So you have people who are, as an example, House Stark. They consider themselves first men because, as the name suggests, they were the first humans in the continent of Westeros. So you could make an argument that they are the original human population living there. And then later on, you have an invasion by another group of people called the Andals. And then you have Dorne, where some of the people, including House Martell, would describe themselves as ethnically being the Rhoynish, who are actually people who originated from the other continent, Essos, which we're going to very briefly talk about to close out this episode. So when you talk about the King of Westeros, like any royalty, they have like a bazillion titles, right? Part of the titles for the King of Westeros is to say that they are the king of the First Men, the Andals, and the Rhoynish. Although the TV show doesn't really mention this, they just shorten it to King of the First Men and the Andals, because a majority of people who live in Westeros, they are either consider themselves First Men or Andal. And the Rhoynish are primarily in Dorne. But again, the TV show kind of cut out things. And I guess the last observation I'll make about Dorne is the fact that based off of some of the clues you kind of get both in the TV show and in the books, it seemed like George used Spain as like his cultural, geographical inspiration for Dorne. And incidentally, the scenes in Game of Thrones, when they were filming scenes that are set in Dorne, they did actually film it in parts of Spain, particularly for the castles, for like Sunspear and the nearby castle of the Water Gardens. They actually filmed it in Seville. And by coincidence, I actually know where they filmed it in, because literally a year before they did the filming, I actually visited the castle, the palace that they used as the outdoor sets. So, which is pretty cool.
That is cool.
Yeah. I guess that's all for Westeros. I guess we'll briefly talk about Essos in the context that there are certain locations that come up in particularly the Daenerys storylines. You wanna talk about it?
Yeah, there's in Essos there are 9 free cities that that we know of, or that are known to be in the area. That's also where the Valerians are originally from. The Dothrakis are also in the area,
Yep.
which are a huge they play, I shouldn't say a huge part, but they do play a very significant part of Daenerys Targaryen's story, at least in the TV series. I don't remember how much they play in the books. I know fairly significant, but I'm not sure exactly how significant.
They're mostly in the first book, aka season 1.
Mhm.
They do come up again towards the end of the 5th book, aka season 5,
Mhm.
which for those of you who've seen the TV show, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Unfortunately, seasons 6 to 8 are going to be based off of the final 2 books that George says he's working on. So we don't ultimately know to what degree
No.
they
Right.
make an impact in the final 2 books. I don't know, but to a degree, they do make an impact. I mean, so for those of you who don't know, the Dothraki are basically wandering horsemen, nomadic people, and they're very known for raiding and pillaging. I guess like for those of us who, especially who happen to be book fans, book readers, we sometimes like to describe them as like knockoff Mongolian uh
Yeah, that's
Genghis
just what I was
Khan
getting
types.
ready to I was just getting ready to say. I think they're most similar to the Mongolian people,
Right.
ancient Mongolian people. Well, even nowadays, they're still fairly nomadic.
Right. We could talk about this more in a later episode, but
Mhm.
for a lot of especially for the book readers, some of us kind of feel like the portrayal of the Dothraki is like basically a kind of like with the Ironborn where they're like an exaggeration of Vikings. A lot of book readers feel that the Dothraki are like an extreme like interpretation of the Mongolian of like Genghis Khan,
Mhm.
um, that sort of thing. Because when you really read like what the stuff the Dothraki actually do, it's like it does get a little racist, to be honest. It's like there's like some racist stereotypes happening. Whether you want to argue what if he's being racist or if it's just or if you want to argue that you know, the interpretation of their culture is through a character who may have questionable views of the world, of how they perceive things. Yeah, you can make that argument that
Mhm.
it's a biased narrator. Um, so the 9 free cities. One of them that's pretty important is Bravos.
Yes.
I think some people feel like Bravos may have been inspired by Renaissance Venice, actually. I've heard that.
I can see it. I can definitely see it.
Yeah. Obviously, like, at least for the TV show, you could kind of see that, the way they designed the set, the city to look like, and even some of the culture that you can see. It does give you a Renaissance Venice kind of feel to it. Which is interesting because Westeros is a fantasy version of medieval Europe. So it's fascinating how by having Bravos be more like Renaissance period, that it's almost making the argument that Essos is more enlightened to a certain degree than Westeros is in terms of culture and development, which is kind of an interesting argument
Mhm.
to make, actually. I guess another place to mention is actually Marine. There's a good chunk of Daenerys' storyline that takes place in Marine, particularly part of season 4 and season 5, actually, of the TV show, where she, for a period of time, she's the queen of Marine. And then there's brief mentions of some of the other cities like Astapor, and Karth.
And Yunkai.
Yes, and Yunkai as well. Yeah, those cities become kind of significant in her plot line because of the fact that they happen to be cities where a huge part of their economy is slavery. It is a huge thing in her storyline, slavery, and her campaign to end slavery by force, which for people who are students of history, we know how that works out. And in a even in a fantasy alternate universe, it's not that different. You just add in dragons and Dothraki and stuff like that, and you kind of get the picture of how that works out. Yeah, I mean those are the main places in Essos that pop up. I guess like the one final place that we briefly will mention, and we made references to it, Valyria. Valyria in this book saga, in this TV show, has almost a mythic, this was Atlantis kind of status to it, except that within the context of this particular universe, it very much existed because the Targaryens, that was where they originally came from. They originally came from Valyria, which I would say culturally is like a fusion. Like it's like a fantasy fusion of mostly the Roman Empire and some aspects of ancient Egypt as well. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah.
Yeah. You just throw in some dragons in there and that's Valyria for you. Pretty much. It was an empire. It conquered actually quite a bit of Essos. In fact, some of the cities that we mentioned earlier, like Bravos and, Karth and Yunkai, Marine, etc. Most of these particular cities, the local language is actually variations of Valyrian language from the Empire of Valyria, which, again, like I was saying earlier, you kind of can tell that Martin actually loosely based Valyria on the Roman Empire, because, of course, as we all know, countries that used to be part of the Roman Empire, they have languages that are based off of Latin. So there we go. Yeah, so the bit I mentioned before about ancient Egypt, yeah, the one notable thing about ancient Egypt that Martin kind of used when he created the Valyrian culture is the fact that some of these noble, particularly the noble families in Valyria, yeah, they kind of did the same thing that the pharaohs did, which is to kind of keep things in the family, we shall say. I'm sure you guys can figure out what I meant by that.
Yeah.
Honestly, we could easily do an entire episode just on House Targaryen. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah,
Because
the
they're
shenanigans.
a lot.
I mean, the shenanigans these people get up to, let me tell you, could take up an entire, no, not even an episode. It would take probably 2 or 3 episodes to cover all the stuff these people were up to.
Yeah. The only
That's why
one I
there's
think that could give them a run for their money would be House Lannister.
Yeah. Although, to be fair, House Lannister does not have dragons.
No, House Lannister does not have dragons, but House Lannister has some really messed up people in it.
Yeah,
And
they
they're
do.
doing some really messed up things.
Yeah. So before we sign off, just as a reminder, we have an email address for you to send in your comments, suggestions for future episodes, things we could do to fix this show because you think we could fix some things. Our email address is 3fatesdecide@gmail.com. It's the title of our show, all in one word.
And the 3 is spelled out.
Yes, it is.
And we also have an Instagram. Unfortunately, at the moment, there is actually nothing on our Instagram. I've been very lax in trying to post stuff, which I will be rectifying this week. You can find us at Three Fates Decide on Instagram. Same thing. We are open to any comments, suggestions, praise, constructive criticism only, please.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Catch us next time.
And see what we're going to talk about.
Because the Three Fates decide.